All right, so complex numbers are when you have a combination of a real number and an imaginary number. So a complex number will look something like this: 7 plus 3i. 7 is a real number. 3i is an imaginary number because it has an I in it, and so if you add them together, it's complex. Part real, part imaginary. Now with complex numbers, there's two basic rules that you'll use to simplify and kind of work with these complex numbers. The first one is square root of -1. Now square root of -1 is not a real number. If you type it in your calculator, it'll say error, non-real answer. It's not a real answer. It is an imaginary answer, and we note it as I. So square root of -1 is I. I squared is the squared of that, which would be -1. It's the only thing that when you square it, it's negative. Usually when you have something squared, it's positive, but this is negative because it is imaginary. So here's what we're going to do with complex numbers. We're going to do some simplifying. And when you simplify, here you have a complex number and a complex number added together. You don't need to use the parentheses at all because there's nothing to distribute. There's no exponent, so we'll just do 7 plus 5. We'll add the real parts. And then 3i plus -4i would be -1i. And add the imaginary parts. So you add the real parts and you add the imaginary parts. That's adding complex numbers. When you multiply, here they're just two complex numbers multiplied together. We'll have to FOIL. So 2 times 4 is 8. Outside is 2 times -1, which is -2i. Inside is plus 12i. And last is -3i squared. What we want to do is combine like terms. These i's can be added together, so that would be 8 plus 10i. And anytime you have an I squared, that's not part of an imaginary number. Imaginary number is real and imaginary. Shouldn't have an I squared. So you want to replace I squared with what it equals. And I squared equals -1. So you do have to have an I in your answer, but you shouldn't have an I squared. You can replace that with what it equals and then keep simplifying. Here we have -3 times -1, so that'd be 8 plus 10i plus 3. And now we have two reals, 8 and 3, that we can add together. So it'd be 11 plus 10i. This last example, we are going to multiply by the conjugate. And I have just a complex number written here. I have to know what a conjugate is and multiply by it. A conjugate is when you have the exact same terms. The 4 and the 3i are the same, but you change the middle sign. So instead of a minus, it would be a plus. So multiplying by the conjugate means you write the conjugate next to it, and now we'll multiply and we'll have to FOIL. So 4 times 4 is 16. Outside is plus 12i, inside is minus 12i, and last is minus 9i squared. Your 12i and your -12i will cancel, and that was minus, so 16 minus 9, I squared is -1. So 16 minus 9 times -1, which would be 16 plus 9, so it is 25.